Hi, good morning. This is Katrina Johantgen. We're going to give folks a few more seconds, minutes here to dial into the webinar as our attendee number is climbing. So thank you all for being on time, and we're going to give those stragglers a little bit of time to log in and get started. Okay, good morning. Hello and welcome. My name is Katrina Johantgen, and I'm the Executive Director of the California School Finance Authority. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our discussion regarding the 21-22 state budget. What a difference a year makes. At this time last year, we were conducting a webinar on our cash flow borrowing program to weather the state deferrals of revenue, and today's presentation highlights a very different scenario for the fiscal year ahead. We're so pleased that you have decided to join us. We understand that it is webinar season, so we are honored that you elected to participate in today's webinar. This is the Putting Deferrals in the Rear View and the Road Ahead for K-12 Districts and Charter Schools webinar. But before we get started, I want to highlight a few obligatory housekeeping items. Today's presentation can be accessed on CSFA's events webpage and has also been included in the presentation chat. We encourage you to submit questions or comments anytime during the program using the box marked questions at the bottom of your control panel. There is live captioning available during today's discussion. Please use the link in the presentation to access live captioning. And if at any time during the presentation you experience technical issues, please contact GoToWebinar at the phone number provided. Next slide. First, I want to provide some information regarding the California School Finance Authority. CSFA was established in 1985 and is one of 16 boards, commissions, and authorities located within the State Treasurer's Office. CSFA is chaired by Treasurer Fiona Ma, with Superintendent Tony Thurman and Director of Finance Keely Martin Bosler serving as members. CSFA administers 12 federally and state-funded financing programs. These programs assist California K-12 schools and charter schools, community colleges, and county offices of education finance the construction, remodeling, and renovation of projects, and also to secure working capital for cash flow purposes. Since 2002, CSFA has disbursed or financed over $4.5 billion to California local education agencies throughout our grant and debt programs. CSFA also conducts educational webinars like this one related to state budget matters, financing opportunities, and student and workforce housing issues. I want to highlight one of CSFA's most recent financing programs. The State Aid Intercept Note Program was developed during the 2021 fiscal year to help K-14 districts weather state deferrals. We set out with our financing team and stakeholders to develop a program that was secure, low cost, and streamlined, and I believe we achieved these goals. The SANE offered cash flow financing for fiscal year 2021 principal apportionment deferrals. 38 school districts and 2 community college districts located in 18 counties throughout the state participated in the March and April issuances. The SANE were secured solely by each participant's pledge of its financed apportionment deferrals. The finance deferrals are being intercepted by the state controller and transferred to the trustee for repayment of the SANE to borrowers. Unlike traditional school district trans, the credit rating for the SANEs are based on the state's credit ratings, an SP1+ from S&P and an F1+ from Fitch, rather than the short-term ratings for each participating district. By avoiding district credit analyses and disclosure in the offering documents, we significantly lowered upfront cost and increased ease of execution on district staff. So you can see on the table that we've provided that there was a March issuance of a tax-exempt series, a taxable series, and a Series B taxable note. And you can see here you've got your yields and your all-in interest costs, which are well below 1%. So you've got it 20 basis points on the taxable series and a blended yield of 65 basis points. The market was a little bit different in April, and we achieved a blended yield of 66 basis points of all-in cost for the taxable Series C and Series D notes. Next slide covers the advances on state aid payments program, which was developed for our charter school borrowers. ASAP program notes finance the fiscal year 2021 principal apportionment deferrals of 62 nonprofit charter school borrowers operating as 40 distinct borrowers located in 22 California counties. These notes were secured by each borrower's pledge of its financed apportionment, similar to the SANES, but also had a reserve fund financed by a federal grant that CSFA had been awarded, and also a letter of credit that was issued by Citi and the Royal Bank of Canada. The finance deferrals are paid similar to SANE by funds that are being intercepted by the state controller and transferred to the trustee on behalf of investors. The MIG-1 credit rating assigned to the ASAP notes is based on the credit rating of the 2 letter credit banks rather than the creditworthiness of each of the charter school borrowers. The LOCs avoided the need for an underlying credit rating analyses, cash flows, and offering document disclosures for each borrower and made the large Tran pool economically feasible. The notes were issued on March 30th, 2021 and will mature on December 30, 2021. There are several structuring elements from both programs that CSFA and its financing team now have at our disposal for future cash flow borrowing programs. As you can see on the table here, on the chart on page 5, the interest rate and all-in borrowing costs for these programs for the charter school borrowers was well below 3%. So at this time, I want to present our panelists and continue with our presentation. We will first hear from Brianna Garcia. Ms. Garcia serves as a Vice President at School Services of California. Ms. Garcia will discuss the governor's budget and LCSF information for 21-22 and the dreaded fiscal cliff we've all been hearing about and how to avoid it. Next up, Eric Premack, Executive Director and founder of the Charter School Development Center, will discuss ADA and funding impacts on charter schools. Brianna will then highlight the state pandemic funding and what that means for you and your organization. Next up, we'll hear from the legend himself, Mike Fine, CEO of FCMAT, or the Fiscal Crisis Management and Assistance Team. It's better to listen carefully to Mike's discussion on cash management, cash flow sufficiency, and insolvency than need FCMAT services later. Thank you, Mike, for joining us again this year for our webinar. Annette Yee, Managing Director at Montague DeRose and Associates, will discuss external cash flow borrowing to meet your cash flow needs. We hope to have enough time at the end of our presentation to answer your questions. Please remember to ask your questions throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to address all of your questions. At this time, Brianna, you can take it away.
Thank you, Katrina. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. As Katrina mentioned, my name is Brianna Garcia. I'm with School Services of California. And I really just want to walk you through a few of the items in this year's budget that we believe are going to have the biggest impacts on your cash flow. So, oops, exactly what I thought I was going to do. So this slide provides you an overview of the major components for the K through 12 education funding as seen at each of the 3 major milestones of the state budget cycle. As you can see from this slide, Proposition 98 is increasing, and it increased by more than $14 billion over the budget period from 2019-20 to 21-22. And so overall, that's great news for education. Where we ended up with over $3 billion in LCFF funding, which provides for that 5.07 mega COLA that it's being called, with the compounded COLA being utilized for several other programs that are part of education. And you'll notice on that very bottom line that deferrals are being fully paid down. And while this slide, a big chunk of it was really focusing on that K through 12 piece, I do want to note that for community colleges, the student-centered funding formula is also receiving the 5.07 mega COLA, which was part of some advocacy work that happened, and that the deferrals are being fully paid down for community colleges as well. The enacted budget utilizes significant one-time spending. The state is spending almost 70% of all education spending in both K through 12 and community colleges on one-time programs. And so that's a sizable chunk of what we're looking at. The ongoing investments that are moving forward are predominantly for LCFF for K through 12 and for SCFF for the community colleges, in addition to a few other educational equity initiatives. And so you can see that while there are a lot of categoricals in this budget, that's where you are noting that large 70% that we're looking at with regards to one-time versus ongoing spending. With regards to K through 12, as we know, the local control funding formula is the main source of funding for local educational agencies. It's comprised of a base grant for each of the 4 grade spans, and that's inclusive of the grade span adjustments for K through 3 and 9 through 12. In addition, there are supplemental concentration grants based on the number of students that are enrolled that are either English learners, free or reduced price meal eligible, or foster youth. As I mentioned on the previous slide, the final budget compromise between the legislature and the governor includes $3.2 billion for LCFF that allows for that 5.07 mega COLA. And lastly, in the first major change to the local control funding formula since Governor Brown introduced it, the concentration grant is increasing from 50% to 65% of the base grant. Though that does not, and I want to emphasize that because we've gotten a lot of questions about this, it does not change the threshold in order to actually receive the concentration grant, which is still at 55% for unduplicated pupils. So this slide just shows you the funding factors for LCFF, and it's inclusive, and you can see that on the second line of that 5.07 mega COLA, and also shows you that new concentration grant amount at 65% on that bottom line. I do want to point out, though, that the $1.1 billion that was included to increase the concentration grant does come with strings, as with lots of things. The additional 15% being provided has to be used to increase the number of credentialed and or classified staff providing direct services to students, and they made it particularly clear to note that that does also include custodians. The increase is going to be measured by school sites, and they're going to require you to compare prior year staff to student ratios at schools with greater than 55% to the staff to student ratios at schools with 55% or less. We've gotten a lot of questions from LEAs out there. Well, what if we're only one school site? What if we are, all of our schools are at 55%? And the trailable language doesn't go into that level of detail, but we are looking for that information. We're reaching out to our contacts at the state, and we'll provide more as soon as we know more. I do want to note that accountability for the use of these funds is going to be part of the LCAP annual update each year. So this is not a one-time thing. This is going to be happening from this year forward, receipt of the monies and accounting for those dollars. But because you've already adopted your LCAP for this year only, there is going to be an LCAP one-time supplement that is going to have to be completed, that where you will discuss how you are spending these dollars. I'll note that this one-time supplement, you're going to have to complete it whether or not you are receiving concentration grant monies, because it is asking for updates and information on other funding sources that are being received as part of the budget. So keep that in mind. You can see the implications of the new concentration grant with this chart. It shows you the per ADA change for 21-22 by UPP quintile, and accounts for both the mega COLA and the increased concentration grant. So those blue bars along the bottom are the base grant, which is roughly equal across all LEAs, with really just differences with regards to grade span distinctions. The orange bars show you the supplemental concentration grant levels that you've been receiving over the last 8 years, and this includes the concentration grant at the 50% mark. And then the yellow bar shows you the increased concentration grant amount of 15%. So you can really see with this chart how dramatic the impact of the change to the formula is on those LEAs that receive concentration grants. By using the concentration grant as a vehicle, the change is really being targeted to those LEAs that have higher need student population, and therefore they are receiving significantly more with that 15% increase. That said, the majority of LEAs within the state are receiving concentration grant funding, as you can see on that bar, that stacked bar that's on the right-hand side. The statewide average unduplicated pupil percentage is about 62%, and about 60% of LEAs are above that 55% threshold, meaning that they are eligible for concentration grants. In fact, the average unduplicated pupil percentage for LEAs that are eligible for the concentration grant is about 77%. So most LEAs will get some benefit, but the magnitude is really going to depend on how high their UPP is. Turning quickly to the local control funding formula for community colleges, they are funded through operations and alternative education grants. The operations grant is comprised of 3 components: funding per county, per school district within the county, and per ADA within the county. And all 3 components get the benefit of the mega COLA. In addition, counties also receive an alternative education grant for the students that they educate directly. Similar to school districts and charter schools, they receive base, supplemental, and concentration grant funding, though they get 35% above the base grant for both their supplemental and concentration grant dollars. And again, the base grants also gets the mega COLA for community college, or excuse me, for county office of education. So we have to say, though, with all this new money that we're getting from the state budget, I would go with no good deed goes unpunished. While education has a lot to be grateful for with this budget, especially after the last year and a half, precaution is still needed and called for. We have been sheltered from the impacts of declining enrollment this year, with school districts facing some of those impacts, and charter schools and county offices actually facing them this year due to the ADA, potential declines in ADA. And I'll go over that issue a little bit more in the next slides. There's the expiration of the pension relief. There's an increase to unemployment insurance rates, the cap on district reserves. There's an influx and rolling expiration of pandemic-related funding. All of these things really do make for treacherous ground for LEAs that need to be navigated. And so we want you, and one of the main reasons for this webinar today is to talk about the fact that while deferrals might not be on the horizon, there are still other issues that are going to impact your cash that you need to keep in mind. So one of those is the cap on district reserves. The enacted state budget set aside about $6.4 billion in the education rainy day fund, because the 4 criteria that trigger a deposit were met. And that's the fact that the maintenance factor from 2014-15 was paid. It's a test 1 year. There was sufficient money to fund ADA and COLA, and capital gains exceeded 8% of the general fund revenues. And so this deposit is going to equal approximately 8.1% of the total K through 12 portion of the minimum guarantee. And that's more than enough to meet the 3% threshold required to actually trigger that cap on district reserves. So beginning in 22-23, school districts cannot have reserves in excess of 10% of their combined assigned and unassigned general fund balances, including that special reserve. There are exceptions. First, basic aid school districts and small school districts, fewer than 2,501 ADA are exempt. And you can ask for an exemption from your county office, and you'll have to show the reasons why you feel you need that higher reserve. But in addition, outside of those, we do not recommend that you just start spending down your reserves. We think you really should now start looking at how you can commit or otherwise utilize those dollars in such a way that you're still maintaining your fiscal solvency and your cash ability to manage your cash, but know that this is on the horizon and it is going to impact how you're budgeting and how you're managing your cash starting next fiscal year in 22-23. As it pertains to deferrals, again, good news there. As I mentioned on an earlier slide, in January, the governor proposed paying down $9.2 billion in deferrals. Again, this is for K through 12, and then increased that pay down to $10.3 billion as part of the May revision. And at that time, it was going to leave only, and I have air quotes that you can't see, $2.6 billion in deferrals remaining. But after negotiations between the governor and the legislature, the final 21-22 enacted state budget includes the pay down of all remaining deferrals. And I will note, as I mentioned before, that's the same for community colleges. The governor actually proposed paying down all community college deferrals as part of the May revision, and that stuck around, and the enacted state budget pays down deferrals for all K through 14. In addition, for K through 12, however, the budget includes the accelerated repayment of the February through April 2021 deferrals. So when the deferrals were first implemented, they were due to be repaid from September through November 2021, and you can see that at the bottom of the slide. The enacted state budget has those deferrals being repaid in August of 2021, along with the May deferral, which was already scheduled to be repaid in August of 2021. The enacted state budget also eliminates the June to July deferral. So they basically struck that language, and so those are gone as well. And so again, for this year, after next month, you will have all of your deferrals repaid, and there are no deferrals, at least in the foreseeable or in the imminent future. Enrollment has already started to decline in California, and the pandemic only made things worse. And so this is a real concern for LEAs. Based on the latest statewide data, enrollment dropped by more than 160,000 students between 2019-20 and 2021. And that's compared to a drop that we were experiencing before that of about 20 to 30,000. So this has really real world impacts at both the Proposition 98 level and at the local budget level. We don't know if this is just a temporary drop, that magnitude, or if those kids are going to come back this coming school year. And so that's a little bit of a wait and see, and I'm sure a lot of you are out there on pins and needles waiting to see what those numbers look like. The legislature did provide a reprieve last year with the implementation of the hold harmless, which required all LEAs to be funded on prior year ADA. For school districts, they really already had the ability to use prior year ADA, but that hold harmless is really coming into play and helping school districts this year. For charter schools and county offices of education, the application of this benefit last year provided a cushion. It provided a 1-year reprieve, though in their case that was short-lived because they are feeling the impacts of that hold harmless reprieve going away starting this year in 21-22. You can see the impacts here that we are calling the fiscal cliff. The hold harmless that was part of last year's budget resulted in the ability of school districts to use the higher the 2019-20 or 21-22 ADA this year. So they really don't feel the impacts of any kind of decline in enrollment until next year, until 22-23. Charter schools and county offices, however, do not have the benefit of this higher of prior year versus current year provision. So that fiscal cliff is very real to them right now. However, for school districts in declining enrollment, they have another year before the impacts are felt, and you really need to start planning now because 22-23 is going to be just around the corner, and you're going to have to accommodate a steeper drop in ADA represented by the difference between 19-20 and 21-22, even if you're using prior year numbers. So it's important that you start to message that to your staff and stakeholders and start now. For charter schools and county office of education, any effects are already built into your budget for this year. For school districts, you should be having conversations about right sizing in accordance with actual ADA decreases and not what you're funded at. And don't overlook this just because you're being funded at a higher amount this year. Again, this year with the hold harmless, the increases in the COLA, the one-time state and federal funding due to the pandemic, all of this is just a temporary reprieve and should not put you in a situation where you're pushing the can down the road just because you have this reprieve right now. And I'll let Eric talk to you a little bit and more specifically about how charter schools are feeling that impact now.
Thanks, Brianna. I'll just underscore what you've noted, and that is that charter schools in the 21-22 fiscal year will enjoy no declining enrollment or no hold harmless protection. And as a result, the fiscal cliff is something that they will feel and experience in real time if they've been losing enrollment or anticipating a decline in average funded average daily attendance, and that will roll through the LCFF funding formula, through lottery, and any of a number of other programs as well. Some charter schools are experiencing an additional cliff, if you will, due to sharp declines in some LEAs in the counts of students who qualify for free and reduced price meals, which is the proxy used for low income status for many key funding programs, especially including the Charter School Facilities Grant Program. And if you fall below the 55% eligibility threshold due to a decline in counts of those students, you can experience a cliff in your funding for that program as well. Next slide, please. I'll also note that growth funding, the bit of good news here is will return in the 21-22 fiscal year after being capped and or unfunded, depending on your school type in the prior fiscal year. So that's a bit of good news. For those of you who are experiencing growth, realize that we return to the normal cash flow procedures related to growth funding, meaning that if you're growing by adding grade levels and have gotten your data into the PenSec system timely, you will receive advance apportionment funding for that growth ADA, most likely starting in the month of September from CDE. If you are growing by other than adding grade levels and or if you did not get your data into PenSec timely, you won't start to see the apportionments catching up with you until after the first principal apportionment, in which case the growth funds will be spread out primarily over the months of February and June. One last piece, I'll go a little bit off slide here just to note that one other bit of perhaps good news for charter schools is that they're not subject to the reserve caps that will be triggered for school districts in future years. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So this year brought an unprecedented amount of state and federal resources. Again, good news, bad news. Ron Bennett used to say the only time there were problems at the negotiating table was when you don't have money and when you do have money. And so this is likely to be something that's the subject of negotiations and other items this year. Each one of the sources on the state side and on the federal side has a different expiration date and different strings attached, and it's all one time. So in addition to accommodating the ADA drop, LEAs need to be planning for the gradual end of these funding sources. This slide outlines the state funding provided and the respective deadlines for each of those. As you can see, the learning loss mitigation funds already came to an end, and both the in-person instruction and the expanded learning opportunities grants expire next year. And so again, as we keep going through it, as Mike starts to talk to you about cash and how that works, you need to keep in mind what's happening with these funds. This slide provides you with the federal funding sources that we've received. Again, the learning loss mitigation funding is done. It expired in May, at the end of May. The GEAR and ESSER 1 monies expire next year, and ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 expire over the following 2 years. Both these and the state funding sources are providing you with a runway and helping you provide additional supports to your students, but we cannot stress enough that they are one time and that you need to plan, you need a plan in place for their use and their eventual expiration. And so if some of these programs you'd like to keep, you need to start planning how you're going to fund those items from your various local sources, or as you're putting some of these new programs or bringing people in place, you need to be working towards or ensuring that those are all temporary uses, that the contracts are for limited times and tied to those funding sources, so that you don't end up in a situation where you have more staff or programs than you can support. As you look at your multi-year projections, these items on this slide will impact cash flow both for the good and the bad, and you need to be able to balance those two things. And I know it's not a requirement for charter schools, but I do believe it's a best practice to look beyond the current year, even if you're not submitting an official multi-year projection. It's good to look forward and start planning how funding sources, your increase or decrease in students, et cetera, are going to be affecting you for several years out, and keeping these types of items in mind as well. And so with the exception of the concentration grant augmentation, all the sources on the left are bringing you a one-time infusion of cash. And the items on the right, with the exception of those reopening costs, will last you longer than a year. And so we really want to keep those concepts in mind of what's short-term, what's long-term, and how the funding sources that you're going to put in place are going to help you manage those different aspects of that. And so with that, I will turn it over to Mike so he can talk to you about how the cash plays out for you as you're working your way through the next year.
Thank you, Brianna, and good morning to everybody. Mike Fine, the Chief Executive Officer at FICMAT. My pleasure to be with you this morning and to certainly join the Treasurer and our invest group of panelists today. So let's start with some basic definitions around cash and cash flow and cash insolvency. Cash is often what we say, it's actually what happens. It's the real world. Conversely, budget, while critical, and we emphasize this critically important, it is in many respects the make-believe world, right? It is what we anticipate to happen, where cash is what actually does happen. Cash flow is very simple. It's the actual inflow and outflow of funds over a given period of time. Most of the time we monitor cash flow monthly, sometimes more frequent than that. And our cash position is simply what is our cash balance in our bank account, in our treasurer holding accounts at our county treasury or elsewhere at the end of that month, at the end of that period. Negative cash positions, which obviously our goal is to avoid those, but they can be mitigated by borrowing, and there's a slide towards the end of our presentation today that identifies various borrowing options and the authorities to borrow. Next slide. What is cash insolvency? Katrina mentioned this earlier in her introductory comments. Cash insolvency occurs when payroll expense exceeds available cash. And I emphasize payroll expense because ultimately that's what the state, why it defines cash insolvency that way. It's when we lose our ability to pay our people. Not only direct their salary, but their health benefits, and also pay our partner agencies, such as CalSTRS and CalPERS. It's not to say that that not having enough funds on hand to pay our utility costs isn't important. It's just not part of the actual definition. You have to remember this. And this is why paying so close attention not only to cash, but to your budget and your overall multi-year planning, as Brianna just mentioned, cash insolvency is a function over time of deficit spending, erosion of fund balance, and sustained negative cash flow. All those may sound like very common sense types of items, and yet, as you all appreciate, we work with districts every day that are struggling with one or more of these conditions. Remind you all, cash is king, and cash shows no mercy. When you're out of cash, the game is over, and that is the trigger for a state emergency appropriation and the resulting changes in your local governance structure. There have been no needs for a state emergency appropriation during the pandemic because everybody has listened carefully and done an excellent job of managing not only budget resources but cash resources. Next slide, Brianna. Cash flow sufficiency is as simple as asking this question: how does an LEA make sure that they have enough cash to make payroll and to pay the bills? It's really in 4 easy steps. Prepare cash flow projections out 18 to 24 months. You want to have that view that goes beyond just the current year. Conduct prompt monthly reconciliation of all of your cash and other general ledger accounts. This is critical for you to do. Updating cash flow projection with actuals each month is also critical. So you replace your projection with what really happened. And then the final typical step is reprojecting your cash receipts and your disbursements for the rest of the period of time. For this year, we have a bonus step, and that is you're going to spend a lot of time updating cash flow projections this year, especially in the first part of the year, because for our K-12 community, and some charter schools and even some community college districts that will take advantage of the variety of new categorical programs and funding resources that are in this adopted state budget. Brianna mentioned some of those state and federal pandemic related, but we have close to 30 new categorical programs for K-12 in this budget, and apportionment schedules have not been established for those yet. And those will be coming out over the next 4 or 5 months from the California Department of Education. And so each time a new apportionment schedule comes out for one of those new programs that you may be participating in, you'll need to do an update. Next slide, Brianna. So let's highlight the difference between budget and cash flow. Good CBOs and fiscal directors understand this clearly, and it's our job to make sure our governing board and the rest of our cabinet, our leadership team in our districts and colleges and charter schools have a thorough understanding of the differences as well. Budget, you can see its characteristics. It's done annually. It's all built on this idea of anticipated revenue and expenditure. So kind of that make-believe world, right? What's anticipated gets trued up to actual when the cash actually comes in and the cash actually goes out. We follow generally accepted accounting principles in how we recognize revenues and accruals. We do updates to our budget for K-12. That's the 45-day update that's coming up here in a matter of a couple weeks. And I encourage every K-12, you should be doing a 45-day update this year. There are significant changes between the May revise, which was probably your source to build your budget upon, the assumptions that were in the May revise, and the actual enacted budget. There's really no excuse not to do a 45-day revision. And then the interim report updates that K-12 do. Same would be true for the community colleges once you get into those routine updates on your 311 reports. Budgets are always fund specific. Conversely, on the cash side, we're monitoring it monthly and we're forecasting monthly. Sometimes in some months of the year, we may even do that weekly, especially for those that are have a higher dependency on local property taxes. You would definitely need to be doing in some months your cash flow weekly. It's all built upon actuals. Your cash and your budget are equalized with accruals at the beginning and the end of the year through receivables and payables. And you, again, want to be doing monthly updates. It is most common that it's your cash flow and your monitoring of your cash flow, that is the first sign of fiscal distress. You see some of the early warning signs of fiscal distress in your cash flow far sooner than you see it in your budget. And the reason for that is you're updating cash flow monthly versus the budget is just done a couple times of the year. And cash is often commingled across all funds. Next slide. So key steps in preparing and monitoring your budget for K-12. Certainly your SACS reports include a whole variety of reporting, but there are 3 major reports in every SACS submission, and that's your budget, the Form 01, etc., your multi-year financial projections that Brianna mentioned, and cash flow. At the community colleges, your 311 reports, and while cash flow is not a required element of the 311, it is certainly a best practice for you to be updating cash flow every time you make a change or report new data in a 311. You're always going to be balancing cash flow to budget, and again, you do that through your accruals, and these are critical. The time period, we want you to look out beyond the current year. Think back to last year at the same point in time, we were looking out over 18 months because the deferrals went out over 18 months. Payback was extended. Even for our charter school partners, as Katrina just outlined, last year's borrowing program and cash advance program, those borrowings were based on a payback or a maturity that went all the way out into December of the current year. And so it's important to have this rolling forward, constantly looking beyond the current year. Monitoring is critical. The timeliness of monitoring can't understate in any way or overstate, for that matter, the importance of that this is done monthly, as I indicated earlier, sometimes weekly. Don't forget, as part of this, you've got to look at your balance sheet accounts, not just budget, but balance sheet accounts such as receivables and payables as well. And you always want to be updating your forecast based on, as I alluded to, as information changes from the state or as actual details come in different than what you had planned. Next slide. Remind you all that as you assess your fiscal risk, this particular chart, these 20 areas are the K-12 version. If you go out to our webpage, we have the exact same information for community colleges and a separate one for charters as well. But in all 3 versions of assessing fiscal risk, cash management is common across all 3 and is a key point of analysis that we would encourage you to keep your eye on. And certainly if we're coming into your district to help you with anything, it is one of the key areas that we look at in assessing your fiscal risk, as I've indicated. Next slide, please. And likewise, the indicators of risk of potential insolvency. Again, this is the K-12 version. There is a indicators for community college and indicators for charter school, also on our webpage. Inadequate cash management is one of those indicators. Again, it's common across all 3 of our organization types that are part of today's audience. And so you can look at this list and see other areas of risk, of indicators of risk, right? But I will tell you, take you back to where I started, and that is definitions. Inadequate cash management leads to cash insolvency, and it's cash insolvency that leads to ultimately the potential for your district to be taken over by the state. And while that doesn't apply to charter schools, it does apply to community colleges and traditional K-12 districts. So I can't, again, overemphasize the critical nature of timely updates and a lot of attention paid to this whole area of cash management. It is how, frankly, we've in part survived the ebb and flow of the last 18 months or so. It's by you paying close attention to your cash and managing that accordingly. Next slide, please, Brianna. As Brianna mentioned, the cliff, the fiscal cliff, certainly for our K-12, both in some cases charters, but certainly for traditional school districts, it's important that we keep our eye on data and respond to early changes and trends. One example of this is enrollment. We know that over 60% of our traditional K-12 school districts are in declining enrollment. As Brianna indicated, the pandemic-related hold harmless, ADA hold harmless expired. That has immediate impacts on charters and county offices of ed, but it has a delayed impact on K-12. And so understanding your trend around enrollment is one example of data points you have to pay close attention to. How much of the loss last year was one time, and how many of those kids will be showing back up in this week or next week or in the couple weeks ahead when most K-12 districts open their new school year. Certainly your financial trends are other examples here. We encourage you always to keep an eye on the separation of one-time versus recurring revenues. Brianna cited roughly 70% of the new money coming into the K-12 environment being infused to K-12 schools this year in the enacted state budget is one-time in nature. One-time funds are not something to shy away from. They're still good dollar bills, and we want them, but they have a slight different tinge and color to them, to their green color. And so you need to treat them different. You need to pay close attention to their expiration dates. Brianna gave you some examples of the pandemic relief dollars and cents as to when their expirations have either already occurred or will be occurring. And you have to pay close attention to that. We've been advising districts, as has school services, for the last number of months to prepare 2 multi-year financial projections. Brianna mentioned MYPs and the impacts of these changing environments we have on our MYPs. In part, we want you to be looking at 2 sets of those. One that's reflective of everything you know, and then one that is prepared without any of the one-time activities, revenues and expenditures, and uses of fund balance, so that you can truly see what's ahead of you in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and make good decisions today with that consideration about what lies ahead. Brianna mentioned this, but I'll emphasize it again. As we look at one-time funds and how those expire, and if you've hired staff with those, you have to pay close attention. You can easily avoid the sudden need to lay off a lot of staff. Keep your eye on attrition. Think about how you're ultimately going to adjust staffing when those one-time dollars expire. And Brianna also mentioned, it's not on bullet on the slide, but she mentioned reserves, and she mentioned the cap on local reserves beginning in 22-23. Our analysis would indicate this is only going to apply to a couple hundred school districts, but nevertheless, there is, as Brianna mentioned, no reason for you to spend down your reserves unnecessarily. You want to maintain those reserves for a strong financial position that they offer you and the flexibility that they offer you during uncertain times in a changing environment. There are easy ways to work around and legitimate ways to work around those local imposition of caps on your reserves. And if you're not familiar with those, please don't hesitate to reach out. Brianna and her team at School Services can offer great advice on that. Myself and our team here at FCMAT can also offer great advice on that. You have board policies already in place around GASB 54. Encourage you to look at those, encourage you to look at the option of using committed funds, which is not subject to the cap, and etc. But don't hesitate to reach out as you begin to deal with that potential reserve cap issue. Well, not potential, but potential impact from the imposition of the reserve cap, which will occur. Thank you, Brianna.
All right, thank you, Mike. My name is Annette Yee, and I work for Montague, DeRose and Associates. We're the financial advisor for the CSFA pooled Tran program, for K through 12 and college districts, as well as the county offices of education. We are also advisor on CSFA's program for charter schools. These are the Tran programs that Katrina talked about at the start of the webinar. Before I begin, here's a little bit of my background. I have worked in public finance for close to 4 decades and have specialized in California school district finance since 1985. I was a school board member at Carmel Unified for 27 years, one of the real pleasures of my life and also one of the biggest challenges. And I bring my experience as an issuer to my work as an advisor. As you just heard from Brianna, Eric, and Mike, the fiscal challenges facing LEAs are not ending with the repayment of the deferrals next month. I would like to talk with you about how to deal with temporary shortfalls in cash. We would always urge you to interfund borrow if you have enough cash and other funds to do so. If you don't, on this slide are the 3 major sources of external borrowing and the Ed Code references that govern those types of borrowings. First, an LEA can either borrow from the county superintendent or the county treasurer. Your county office of education will be able to help you if these are the options you would like to pursue. If your LEA is interested in borrowing through the financial markets, you can consider a tax and revenue anticipation note, or TRAN. I will talk more about TRANs in the next few slides. TRANs are short-term borrowings that can help bridge cash flow timing gaps. They are issued to even out temporary cash deficits caused by uneven receipts of revenues, such as from property taxes, last year's state deferrals, or the one-time only funds from either the state or the federal government. TRANs cannot solve structural budget deficits. In order to determine whether you need a TRAN, you will need to look at your monthly cash flows. By monitoring your actual cash flow from the past, like Mike was talking about, you will learn better about what to expect in the future. Understanding how cash affects your LEA is important in terms of good fiscal management. Being able to predict your lowest cash points, and particularly any cash shortfalls, is critical. If you find that you do need to issue a TRAN, a tax-exempt TRAN will have a lower borrowing cost than a taxable one. This is because investors are willing to accept a lower interest rate since they won't pay taxes on that investment. There are rules associated with issuing on a tax-exempt basis. One such rule is that the cash flow deficit must be met within 6 months of issuance. There are also rules on how TRANs are sized, and they must be repaid within 13 months. Last year, CSFA created its Tran program to help bridge the cash shortfalls caused by deferrals of state apportionment. Thankfully, as you have heard, those deferrals have ended, and they're even being paid faster. This has allowed us to transition last year's program into a more traditional Tran program. This year's K through 14 pool is open to all California school districts, community college districts, and county offices of education. Last year, the Tran program proved to be low cost to issuers, and this year's program is expected to continue in this vein, as the program will have the same financing team and will continue to be overseen by the state treasurer's office. We are beginning to hear that some LEAs are interested in a TRAN borrowing to overcome the delays inherent in the ESSER reimbursement process. We will plan issuances as needed depending on LEA interest. We've gotten some questions today already about whether we are planning to do this, and that is the case, that we will be doing TRANs as needed to help fund the shortfalls for due to ESSER needing to pay up front in order to be reimbursed. Please note that because the 2020-2021 deferral Tran will be made, that the deferrals will be repaid earlier, as Brianna discussed. The set-aside payments for the Trans will be made earlier as well. This next page outlines the 7 main steps to issue Trans through CSFA after the initial submission of an application. We anticipate this process will take approximately 4 months to complete. In step 1, districts will prepare monthly cash flows to determine their cash deficit used to size their Tran. The financing team will provide assistance throughout this process and will coordinate the rating agency's review of credit materials. In steps 2 and 3, the bond counsel and disclosure counsel firms appointed by the state treasurer's office will draft resolutions, other financing documents, and the preliminary official statement, or POS. The POS will include information about each district or charter school participating in the pooled Trans. Disclosure counsel staff will work with each LEA to assemble their section of the POS. In step 4, the authorizing resolutions and substantially complete versions of the financing documents and POS are provided to each participating LEA for their board actions. The CSFA board will be provided these same items for board actions authorizing the Tran issuance. Moving down the page to step 5, the Tran of each participating district will be assigned a credit rating, and districts with the same ratings and credit features will be grouped into one series. When the POS is deemed complete by CSFA, the state treasurer's office, and the financing team, the POS will be posted for review by investors. In step 6, after the POS has been available for review by investors for about a week, the underwriter will run an order period to set the interest rate for each series of Trans. The interest rate will be the lowest rate that fully places each series with investors. CSFA's financial advisor and the state treasurer's office will oversee the pricing process for the Trans to ensure that the interest rates are fair and on market. Lastly, in step 7, within 1 week of Trans pricing, the final official statement will be posted to the market. The Tran proceeds will be provided to each LEA approximately 2 to 3 weeks following the Tran pricing. As we said before, we have an experienced finance team to help LEAs with their Tran borrowing needs. If you are interested in a Tran, or if you have any questions about the program, please contact us. This final slide has the contact information of our speakers. And at this point, we will start the Q&A part of the webinar. If you have any questions, please post them in the question area. Since we are concentrating today on cash flow, and the fiscal cliff, some questions already posed may not be answered during the Q&A. If we don't get to your questions today, we will follow up with you afterwards. At this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mike Kramer, who will be coordinating the questions to the speakers. Mike?
Thanks, Annette. This is Mike Kramer with Montague DeRose and Associates. We have received a number of questions through the chat through GoToWebinar. We'll respond to a few today that are relevant to cash flow, as Annette mentioned. So I have a couple for Brianna, a couple for Mike Fine, and then I have a last question, if we have time permitting, for Brianna, Mike, and or Eric. So Brianna, I think this question is best suited for you. Is the reserves cap that you mentioned applicable to charter schools or charter districts?
So the reserve cap is not applicable to charter schools. It is only applicable to school districts. And that's an interesting question with regards to charter districts, only because I hadn't really thought about it and what their legal distinction is within the code. They are school districts that converted to charter schools. Mike, would you happen to know where they fall on that continuum?
If they are, so I believe they're still subject to the minimum reserve requirements, but Eric may know this better. If they're subject to the minimum reserve requirements, then I believe they would be subject to they're not an excluded entity in the cleanup legislation we did several years ago. Eric, frankly, would be the expert.
Yeah, Mike, I think it's a bit of a legal no man's land. I'm not sure the law is terribly clear on this, and it might be one that, to put it on firmer legal ground, perhaps getting an exemption from the county superintendent or what have you might help to clarify things.
Yeah, and again, there are easy workarounds to some of this. So if you believe you're subject to it, reach out to one of us and we can guide you on how to easily solve the problem.
Most of the all charter districts are quite small, and there are a number of workarounds that one could anticipate there.
Okay, Eric, let me throw a question your way that just came in since we're kind of on topic here. So regarding cash going to charters from the state or the chartering district, the question regards to the state or district holding back cash to the charter. And the question is there any way, any guidance maybe for the charter on how to navigate, the timing of funds coming in from the chartering district or the state? I know this is kind of a broad question, but any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of this just comes down to building local relationships, and we often find that if there's any kind of a dispute over the timing of cash, that the apportionment schedules that the California Department of Education posts are often a helpful kind of neutral ground, if you will. And we often advise charter schools to prepare a little schedule of what they're anticipating from the district, particularly as it relates to the transfer of in lieu local property tax money, and try to have a dialogue over that so that both sides understand what's due and when. We find that kind of neutral information, factually presented early in the process, helps avoid these kinds of disputes.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Brianna, back to the reserve cap discussion. Does the cap apply to just the general fund or to all funds of the district, such as this Fund 40 Special Reserve?
No, so it applies to the general fund and Fund 17, the Fund for Special Reserves. It does not apply to, Fund 40 for facilities or, cafeteria funds or any of those other funds. And so that's, as Mike mentioned, there are a number of ways to work around this so that you're not spending down your reserves, and that's one of them. If you know that you're going to have some facilities work coming up, et cetera, transferring some funds, some of those monies from the general fund over to one of those restricted funds is one of those ways that you could set aside some dollars and not have to spend them down. And again, it's assigned and unassigned balances in the general fund. And so also, as Mike mentioned, if you commit the funds, that also then excludes them from that calculation.
Okay, thanks, Brianna. So a few questions for Mike Fine. One of the attendees wanted confirmation that all the deferrals will be paid back by end of August.
That's correct. That's what the trailer bill called.
Okay, thanks. Another question was, if districts are able to borrow cash temporarily through interfund transfers, is it recommended that they pay interest back to the fund that it is borrowed from?
Great question, Mike. If the fund is restricted in some nature, and the most common of those would be your bond funds, we would always recommend that you pay interest if you're borrowing from bond funds. Number one, we would mention about borrowing from bond proceeds to start with. CDAC, which is part of the state treasurer and FCMAT, both caution against that and probably make a case for not doing that. But if you were to make that local decision with the counsel of your bond attorney to do so, we would definitely recommend paying interest on it at the same rate that the funds would have otherwise used, to avoid any claim that your bond proceeds were used for an administrative purpose, which of course would be a violation. Borrowing between Fund 1 and Fund 17, when they're by the state in essence treated alike and for the same purpose, I don't know that you'd pay interest to. Borrowing with Fund 25, which are developer fees, again, very restricted. Funds are put in there for specific purpose. They're collected and deposited and then used for very specific purposes. In accordance with the law, I'd pay interest on that as well. So I think the answer, Mike, is it's a best practice to do so, but it does vary by fund and the nature of the fund.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I think the last question we have, at least for today, on cash management is a good one. I mean, your slides on cash flow were phenomenal, and I think there's some folks out there that would like some follow-up, and they're asking, are there any classes offered on cash flow management that they could attend, or any webinars?
So FCMAT doesn't offer a direct one on cash flow itself, but we do offer for those districts that use Projection Pro, which is a software that we developed and is available for free that serves K-12 community. That is that's a piece of software that supports your MYP projections and calculations, and also your cash flow. And so the training that we do on Projection Pro includes best practices on cash flow as well. So that would be the closest thing that we have, and we offer those trainings periodically during the year. So just our webpage, and we call it professional learning. I was just on there this morning, and our schedule for this fall is not posted yet, but it will be shortly. And there will be opportunities for Projection Pro training, and you'll get some good cash management practices from that.
And I'll note that school services, we are going to be doing a webinar in October on managing cash, and you can find that information on our website as well. It'll be just a 2-hour webinar to have that conversation. We did it actually in conjunction with FCMAT last year, and we'll be doing just a shorter version since the deferrals, et cetera, aren't something that's on the horizon. So we'll be doing a shorter version this year.
Thank you.
Also note,
yeah.
Charter School Center also offers a charter school specific version of cash flow training as part of our larger charter business officer training program, and we can make that module available as a one-off to folks who need it for just cash flow specific purposes.
There you have it, three great options to learn more about cash flow management. So we received a few questions in regarding the authority's ongoing pool trans programs. There were some slides about the K through 12 or K through 14 pools. I think, and we're getting questions regarding similar offerings for charter schools. I think while nothing is in concrete for either districts or charters at this point as far as a pooled offering, I think we're open to really gauging demand. So and I think the charter specifically, it's more of a case-by-case basis as for what we can do for the charters. So I think if you're interested in a trans through the authority, whether it's your district or your charter school or your CMO, I would encourage you to contact Katrina Johantgen directly, and we can then noodle on that and get back to her right away with our thoughts. So one more question that is kind of broad, but I think I'll put out to Brianna, Mike, and Eric. So there have been many questions coming in through the chat and submitted in advance of the webinar about independent study and how it could affect enrollment, funding, financial planning, I think it was mentioned that we could spend an hour on this topic alone, but if each of you would like to say maybe a couple of words about independent study and how it may affect a district or a charter, we can probably wrap up with those answers.
So this is Mike. I'll take the risk here of starting out, and Brianna and Eric can correct everything I tell you that's wrong. First, as independent study relates to cash management, it's the same relationship it's always been. There are two independent study programs, both generate ADA, but differently. There's the traditional independent study program, which is the focus of the changes that were made in AB 130, the K-12 trailer bill. The second independent study program, which frankly very few traditional K-12s use, it's more broadly used by charter schools, but in total, actually very little ADA in total, but it is something that I would recommend everybody look at, and that is course-based independent study. It does generate its ADA differently, but because they are ADA generating programs, their cash flow is just simply part of the monthly advanced apportionment or principal apportionment. Cost structures obviously vary, and the new requirements will add some cost structures because there's requirements for daily and every few days and weekly live interaction and so on. That will impact caseloads, probably the number of teachers that can, number of students assigned to a teacher, because they might have, depending on grade level, some daily work to do as opposed to every several week work to do. CSBA just released yesterday the sample policies on independent study, so I encourage you all to that subscribe to Gamut to take a look at those. There are also some other county offices that have begun to publish some best practices in thinking along the required changes. There's the whole waiver process also that's being discussed right now, and what that entails and what the fiscal hardship would be. I remind most folks that the new requirements really don't differ a whole lot from what we did over this past year with respect to virtual instruction. I think while it is a change, it's not a dramatic change from what we did this past school year, but little to no impact on cash flow, Mike, would be my input.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, and we just posted a fiscal article about it, is the impacts with the new independent study and the J13 waivers, especially with all the fires that we have going on, with the pandemic still flaring up here and there. You want to make sure that you understand what the requirements are now with regards to the J13 and being required to provide some independent study option if those school closures go for longer than one might anticipate with some of that. And so that's something else to keep in mind as you're moving forward. Again, with that J13 waiver, you are still provided with funding for days that closure is required, but you do have an additional requirement now, potentially, depending on how long that closure goes.
Okay,
I'll
thanks,
only
Mike.
add that I think Mike nailed the cash flow piece on the head. The larger topic is it could be its own 5, 6, 8 hour webinar. And we'll be publishing a charter-specific set of independent study policies as part of our larger compilation, and have an update on that coming either later this week or early next week.
Okay, thank you all very much. I would just remind folks that the webinar slides are already posted on CSFA's website under events, and the recording of this webinar will be posted at a later date, probably within a matter of a couple days, I imagine, or early next week. So I think that's it for now. I will hand it back to Katrina to wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you found this webinar instructive and helpful. It sounds like there's a lot more to kind of be revealed in the next couple months as it relates to school finance. Our gratitude is extended to all of our panelists, Brianna Garcia, Eric Premack, Mike Fine, Annette Yee, Mike Kramer, and our colleagues at CDAC, the California Debt and Investment Advisory Committee, who make these webinars possible for us to disseminate information to our stakeholders. As Mike mentioned, the presentation can be found on CSFA's webpage, as well as information on our financing programs. So at this time, many thanks. So long and farewell.